I think Zelensky and his friends will obviously know when there are Russian tanks in Kiev. I'm afraid that's what it's probably going to take. And I think Mr. Putin has figured that out. And I sense that something really big is coming. Remember, they have over 100,000 Russian troops in Belarus to the north of Kiev. They have 700,000 or so in and around Ukraine. These forces can be moved and concentrated very quickly in any number of different directions. What's left of the Ukrainian army is now taking a beating in front of Kharkov and falling back towards Kiev. It's a matter of making the decision to pull the trigger and move decisively over the Dnieper River and then down from the north. And I think that's probably going to happen. I mean, how else do you make your point? And I think Putin, again, as we've discussed before, is the one Russian who has always been most favorably disposed to us in the West. He's lived in the West. He knows the West. This is the last thing that he wanted. He has no interest in conquering anything. He doesn't want to cross that river. He doesn't want to have to govern Ukrainians. That's the last thing he wants. He's not a fool. He wants very much what Solzhenitsyn wanted, which is this Russia, only Russia, with a few exceptions, because there have always been non-Russians in Russia, and many of them, as you've seen with the Chechens and others, have fought very valiantly for Russia. This was true under the Tsars. But this is not something that he wants in Ukraine. He knows that the people in the West want to govern themselves. In fact, in the Kremlin, people openly chuckle over the Poles and their interest in Western Ukraine. And the view is, if the Poles are dumb enough and want to go in there, let them do it, because they all know how that worked out in the past. The Poles and the Ukrainians have killed each other with great glee and enthusiasm. You know, the Ukrainians during the German Second World War, when the Germans were in Ukraine, killed 100,000 Polish men, women, and children. There's so much hatred, blood, and violence left over in that country that the Russians don't want to go in there. But if the Poles want to go, they're saying, hey, good luck with that. I think they just want this to be over and get back to normal. There's never been, as John Mearsheimer has said it 1,000 times, every time somebody brings up this nonsense, well, Putin wants to conquer Eastern Europe, restore the Soviet Empire.
Well, that's Lindsey Graham's nonsense.
Yeah, it's absolute bull. It's not true. And I hope that people in Europe are waking up to it. I think they probably are waking up quicker because, again, here in the United States, Judge, most Americans don't care.
Right.
They're not interested. You know that.
Right.
That's the problem, because when it's not that we're complacent. I mean, actually speaking, I think it's very healthy for most Americans to worry about their own country and stay in it. I think that's a good thing. And they're much more worried about the border and this migrant invasion, and they should be. But the problem is that gives license to people like Lindsey Graham and the multitude of globalists and neocons over the last 30 years that have dragged us into all of
Nobody wakes up and pays much attention. That's the problem. I'm going to guess that you were not surprised at the summary rejection by Western leaders of what I thought was a thoughtful peace offering set out by President Putin since last you and I were on air together. No, and unfortunately, I don't think President Putin was surprised either. I think this was sort of a final step, alerting everyone that this is really the last opportunity to negotiate any sort of solution on the ground in Ukraine that would result in anything positive, probably for Ukraine and the West. Why would the West not take it seriously? We all know that Putin doesn't bluff. We all know how weak NATO is. We all know how determined he is to assure the Russian people of a neutral, non-NATO Ukraine, or whatever remains of Ukraine. Well, you're dealing with people in Washington who just cannot reconcile themselves to a world that is very different from what they imagine it to be. They're having difficulty coping with reality. They're losing on every front, everywhere. The world is effectively walking away from the United States, certainly away from Washington, and to a large extent away from the West. So what do? You can't easily go to the electorate that put you in power and say, look at the job I've done. No one wants to deal with us. Everyone's abandoning us. We are militarily incompetent. Our equipment isn't very good, and the Russians are victorious, and things aren't going very well for our supposed ally Israel. Before we get to Israel, how outmaneuvered, outflanked, and even embarrassed was the U.S. State Department by President Putin's trip to... agreement with North Korea? Well, it's very hard to tell. We've always had misguided views on North Korea. North Korea was never a Chinese satellite. Everyone acts as though China is the sort of evil force behind North Korea. Nothing. You are the second person to correct me on that this week, because I thought for years that it was. Ritter says no, and you say no, please, no. I mean, it just isn't. Never was. The Chinese were always very angry with the Soviets because the Soviets dragged them into war in Korea that they never wanted to fight. They didn't want to fight with us. We didn't want to fight with them. That was one of those wars that could have easily been avoided, but for a whole range of reasons, it wasn't. But afterwards, the Chinese were sort of stuck with the bill, if you will. But from that point forward, relations between the Koreans and the Chinese were very, very hostile, and they still are. I mean, quite frankly, privately they have frank discussions, but they're not friendly at all. But on the other hand, Moscow has seen North Korea as somewhat useful from time to time, particularly when Moscow wants to horizontally escalate. And that's really what Putin has been doing, not just in North Korea, but also with his trip to Vietnam. He's demonstrating not only that much of the world has actually defected from us to Moscow and Beijing, but he's also showing us that he has the ability to create enormous trouble for us. And obviously, North Korea is an easy choice. North Koreans are desperate for whatever the Russians are willing to give them. The Russians have provided them food and kept them from starving to death on more than one occasion. So right now, the North Koreans will build as much artillery ammunition as the Russians need. In fact, the North Koreans, I'm told, have promised, or at least offered, to send troops to fight in eastern Ukraine. Now, the Russians don't need that, but they nevertheless have made those offers. So I think this is another signal to us. You're going to play in our backyard, you're going to threaten us, you're going to try to destroy us. Well, we have abilities to do enormous damage to you. Do you think, or do you fear, I should say, that this agreement between Russia and North Korea will regenerate Kim Jong-un's dreams of a unified peninsula under his domain? Well, I'm not sure. I think North Korea is still very weak. This is a population that, if you look at the average height in North Korea, it's substantially smaller than the average height in South Korea. The diet is poor, living conditions are terrible. There's been no improvement in life for the people that live in North Korea at all. So I'm not sure that you can really imagine such a thing happening. I think the real tragedy here is that Donald Trump had an opportunity to denuclearize the peninsula. That's something that China wants, because in return for denuclearizing the peninsula, China is quite willing to let South Korea take the place over and run it. I mean, if you look at North Korea and South Korea, it's similar to what East Germany was to West Germany, right? Moscow had to make a choice, and Moscow said, I'm going with West Germany. It's productive, it's more successful. When it reunites with East Germany, it's going to be a big trading partner and a useful scientific industrial partner for us. Same thing is true for China. They'd much rather have the North Korean regime gone and the peninsula reunited. The problem is that can't happen as long as we insist on staying there. And now that North Korea has reaffirmed its commitments to Russia, and Russia has reaffirmed its commitments to North Korea, the probability of reunification peacefully is very low right now and probably won't return for many, many years. In the meantime, given the trajectory in the United States, we're on the path to bankruptcy. Let's be frank. Nassim Taleb's black swan is hovering just ahead of us. I doubt seriously that in 10 years we'll be there. I think we'll probably be gone within the next 3 to 5 years. We simply can't afford to stay everywhere. How dangerous to the west coast of the United States is North Korea? It's not dangerous at all, because if they were to launch a nuclear weapon at us, they would be incinerated in the space of a few hours. There's nowhere to hide in that country. So, yeah, they're no danger to us. They're not, contrary to popular belief, insane. They're not going to commit suicide if they're asked to do so by Moscow. Moscow is not going to ask them to do that. They like the situation that they've got right now. They've got a firecracker that they can light anytime they care to, that will draw attention away from what's happening in Europe or anywhere else and become a magnet for our resources and military power. And that's really what it's about. So Putin is trying to, if I were to ask you what's in it for Putin, you would say driving the Pentagon and the State Department crazy and getting us to waste our resources. Sure, and it also makes it hard on the Republic of Korea down south. They have to travel to Moscow, they have to negotiate deals and try to find a way to keep North Korea under control. China doesn't like it, but China recognizes that the opportunity for anything good to happen is gone for some time as a result of the current administration. so they'll live with it. The Japanese are unhappy about it. They don't want this to go on, but they understand what it's about. We're the ones that don't seem to understand what it's all about. And for the Russians to be in Vietnam, to be in Cuba, to be in Venezuela, to be in North Korea, these are pluses. These are opportunities to poke us in the eye and remind us that they can create a lot of trouble for us whenever they choose to do so, much as we're creating trouble for them in Ukraine and with NATO. Exactly. Also, since we spoke last, Colonel, I don't know if it was the White House or the State Department or the Defense Department. One of them made an announcement about Ukraine getting to the head of the line with respect to receiving serious offensive missiles from the United States. How dangerously low is the American stock of missiles if, God forbid, we need them for our own defense? I'm told that our stocks are... this is why war has changed. So the Russians move forward, they launch their attack, they move forward, and they get their infantry in, and they dig in. Now the Ukrainians have the sky over that area covered with drones. If you try and move your troops in, they're going to hit you with the drones. I just had two very good friends get hit by a drone last night. They both survived, but it's dangerous. So what do the Russians have now? They have drones that resupply. And so the troops go in, dig in, and then the resupply drone comes in, gives them their food, gives them their medicine, delivers the mail. If the Russians have a wounded guy, they now have a drone to take a wounded guy out. And so the Russians just dig in, and then they bring them their anti-tank missiles, they bring them the stuff they need. And now the Russians have built this defense system that, when the Ukrainians come, is going to slaughter them. They're going to be hit with FABs, they're going to be hit with drones, they're going to be hit with artillery, they're going to be hit with TOS, the thermobaric weapons. This isn't even going to be a close fight, it's going to be murder, slaughter. That's what the Russians are doing right now in Kharkov, and the genius of this is they're doing it as far away from Odessa as possible. I just want you to think about that. They're doing it as far away from Odessa as possible. What I'm saying is all of Ukraine's strategic reserves that were supposed to secure Odessa are going to be sacrificed in Kharkov, and Russia still has 300,000 troops it hasn't committed to the fight.